Well, thank you guys and ladies for inviting me. I really enjoy coming to Landrum every chance I get. I'm the horticulture agent for Spartanburg County, and I love coming to Landrum because there's this wonderful restaurant down the road here that I love their onion straws. If you haven't been here in the hound, oh gosh, you don't know what you're missing. All the stuff she read, as my grandfather once told my father, he said, "You're paying for that kid to go learn how to be a fancy farmer." So I said, well, it's a little more technical than that, but okay. So a little quick history about what we do in Spartanburg. I'm your horticulture and natural resources agent, so I do all things horticulture. If you got gardening questions, I got a question before we started talking about groundhogs and possums and skunks. We do programs on that. We're trying to do more stuff up here in Landrum because we love you guys. We want to come back and see you. So appreciate it. Please tell the library what you guys want to hear, and I can usually make a program pretty quick. So I'm usually pretty flexible. So tonight we're going to be talking about composting. So we're going to do this kind of two parts. So the first part, we're going to talk about buying compost because I get a lot of questions about how, what kind should I buy, and since this is being recorded, anything that you see brand names are not necessarily endorsed or they're not really being critiqued. I'm just talking in generalities, but we'll get into that in just a minute. So with that, why would you want to bother composting? So the biggest reason is improved soil texture. What kind of soil do we have here in South Carolina? Clay, yeah, good old clay soil. And everybody wants to know, how can I remove the clay and put something back? And it's like, well, the best thing you can do is amend your clay soil. In fact, I tested my wife. I amended our garden beds with some compost, and I showed it to her. I said, she's like, "Where'd you get that? How much did you pay for that?" And I said, "I didn't pay anything for it." I said, "I probably got $20, $30 in it for the whole thing." And she said, "You're lying. What'd you do with our money?" I said, "No." I said, "Really?" And I showed her what I did, and she was just fascinated because it didn't look like the clay red soil that I'd started with. So it does break up clay. The number one thing you can do to break up clay is to add organic matter, whether that's compost, whether that's manure. You guys have an abundance, I'm sure, of horse manure up here. So that works too. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It helps hold moisture in sand. So if you have sandy soils, it helps to break up some of that water, that leaching capacity that sand has. And I'm going to try not to stand in y'all's way, so if I get in your way, just tell me to shoo, okay? Like I said, as organic matter, the biggest thing that it does, especially good healthy compost, it adds beneficial microbes and bacteria back to your soil. That's what a lot of soils are missing nowadays. There's not just bad bacteria and bad fungi in the world. There's also very good ones, very useful ones for helping break down the nutrients. Has anybody ever heard the old expression, "I need to let my fertilizer soak in"? Anybody ever heard that expression before? Must be a Tennessee thing. So a lot of the more seasoned citizens back in Tennessee that I learned from would always talk about soaking in their fertilizer. And I used to want, what kind of crazy crackpot, well, when I went off to college and learned about nitrogen-fixing bacteria and all these bacteria and fungi that are responsible for breaking those nitrogen ions and ammonia ions back down to nitrates that the plants can take up, that's what they meant. They just didn't know what they were talking about. So it's kind of like the old adage, we lime to sweeten the soil. Well, what they really don't know is the science that it's actually raising the pH. So, all right, so let's say we want to buy some compost. We're going to Big Blue or Big Orange or the other Big Blue from Arkansas, and we're going to see what we can find. So it comes in many shapes and sizes. Just ignore the little black dot in the center of that green bag. Everybody's seen that, I'm sure. So compost, or as we say in the stores, compost, is usually about 30% actual compost. And it's usually a mixture of silt and sand and maybe some manure added into it. The biggest selling point in marketing behind compost nowadays is growing bigger plants. There's one in particular that makes a certain little blue fertilizer that is really after a lot of that stuff. So I'm not saying they're a bad company, I'm not saying they do a bad job, actually produce great stuff. It's just, keep in mind that's what you're buying. You're buying usually a lot of manure when you buy that. Now, speaking of manure, we prefer to have composted manure, and I throw that in here just because we're talking about composting. If a farmer around here calls you and says, hey, I've got lots of fresh horse manure, you can have it as much as you want, just come get it, that's great, but a lot of the horse manure has a lot of salts in it. So what you want to do is pile that manure, and even cow manure and chicken manure can have it too if it's fresh. You want to pile that up and let it sit for about 30 days and turn it every week or so to let it compost. The reason being is and let it rain on it, because a lot of those salts and heavy ammonia ions are being pushed out of that. So, and by the way, I'm going to pick on the pasture people for a second. I don't think this is used much in horse, but I know in cattle production, there's a product called Grazon. Grazon is a 2,4-D product, so it's a broadleaf weed killer. It can survive the ruminant animal all the way into the end product, shall we say. And we have actually seen when people use that, even if it's composted, it will still kill tomatoes. So now, don't walk up and just start asking the farmer, you know what they use. Just ask them if they, what they did to keep their pastures clean. If they start saying something about, yeah, I use this product called Grazon, it's great. Yeah, I'll pass on your free manure. So moving on. You can also use earthworm castings and mushroom compost. And I get this question a lot. What is the difference between regular compost, garden compost, quote unquote, and mushroom compost? Mushroom compost is used compost, is essentially what it is. What they do is they grow mushrooms in it. Those nutrients are helped to grow mushrooms. Then when they're done, after the production cycles, they clean them out, they sterilize it again, or compost it one more time, actually. Then they sell it. So that's what it is. I do like it. It tends to have a higher salt content, which just simply means it's a little more nutritious for the plant. So I say use it sparingly. Really and truly, once you get one you like, stick with it, is what I always say. I personally buy the yellow bag with the moo on it. So y'all can get my drift. That's what I like. I also usually buy compost in bulk just because I usually get a better deal. Speaking of which, you do get a better deal in bulk when you buy it. Henson sells this, but you can also go straight to the source. Southern Mulch has a pretty good compost that they sell, but Atlas Organics is probably the best I've ever seen. And they're not paying me to say that, I promise you. And actually Henson sells their product. But Southern Mulch is pretty comparable. What they do is Atlas Organic actually takes vegetable household waste. You sign up and they give you a little bin. You dump all that stuff in, and then they go turn that into compost. So the one at Southern Mulch is more of a traditional yard clippings and stuff like that. So it's all good stuff. So if ever you want to try and find that in bulk, that's usually the places to go. Going rate for bulk compost right now is about $20 to $30 a yard. And you say, well, preacher, how much do I need? That's another question I get a lot. So the biggest thing is, let's say we're just top dressing with compost, and we're just going to do a light layer on top of our vegetable beds. For a 50 square foot area or a 5 by 10 area, you're looking at about 2 cubic feet. That's give or take. Don't take these as gospel, okay? John, Mark, and Luke, and Matthew did not write this, okay? This is just estimates. So that's why you see the 0.5 and the 0.75 out here. That's just kind of estimates. Just to give you an idea of how much you're going to need. So you can see here, now, this 2 inches deep for amending new lawns or new landscape beds or new vegetable beds. Look how much you're going to need for an acre. That's 268 cubic yards. It's a lot. So you can probably cut that in half and be fine. I would rather see you add little amounts of organic matter over time, as opposed to do it all one shot Johnny and never do anything again. So that's usually what we recommend to folks. Now, when you're top dressing a lawn, or like I said, mulching, this is what this would look like, how much one would cover. And this is all in your handout, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But we're here to talk about making our own home brew, right? All right, so we want to make home brew. So what's going on in a compost pile? What makes a good compost pile? What do you guys think of when you think of a good compost pile? Yes, ma'am.
Well, you need carbon, you need nitrogen. Is that what you're asking for? You want, you need...
You're doing good.
You need water.
Need water. Why do you need water?
You need to, I don't know, that's good, because it brings oxygen, it brings moisture.
Bingo. It supports the microbes. It also does what when it heats up? Creates steam. So, all right.
It gets hotter.
Correct. So you're going to get it hot. The idea is, that's why we always talk about cooking compost. So the idea is we're putting all this water and oxygen and raw materials into this compost pile, and then we're basically creating one big cycle is what we're doing. We're basically mimicking, it's controlled decomposition is what it is. So it's what we're looking for. So if it's too rich in greens or nitrogen-rich materials, it won't work. If it's too much browns or carbon, it won't work. It has to be a certain balance. We'll talk about that balance in just a minute. So let me get all these up here. I used to get on this kick. I get on these kicks like with these talks about, do I want one thing popping up? So good stuff. So good stuff is stuff we want in our compost pile, okay? So this is the Holy List. This is written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you do want pine needles, grass clippings, leaves, kitchen scraps. You can use eggshells, tea bags, coffee. You can even use sawdust. Now eggshells, I would rinse them if I were you, just because that attracts certain little furry animals with long tails. So I would do that. You can use yard trimmings that are broken down. I wouldn't go any branches bigger than a ½ inch unless you chop them up in a wood chipper or break them down into very small pieces. Now, the not so good stuff. Why would I not want to put meat, old meat from dinner the night before on my compost pile?
Critters.
Yeah, remember that thing with the long thin tail? They love that. It also brings in maggots that will not be fun. You don't want any bones for obvious reasons. No fatty foods like cheese, salad dressing. So be kind of picky when you're choosing. Cooking oil. Really the biggest reason is just because it will not break down. So that's usually the biggest reason. I actually once had a guy tell me that he put motor oil in his compost pile. And I'm like, okay, number one, why would you put motor oil? So sin number one was pouring motor oil on the soil. Sin number two was, well, I guess one was thinking about it, but anyway. So now on here I've got weeds. Now, you will hear horticulturists and plant scientists and agriculture people talk about compost weeds, and you'll hear other ones go, blasphemer, don't put weeds in your compost pile. So if it doesn't have weed seeds, you're probably okay. The thing is, I don't care how good your compost pile is, I don't care how hot it gets, unless you steam sterilize it to 180 degrees, 200 degrees for about 30 minutes, you're going to have weed seeds in it, okay? So accept it. It's okay. So I tell, y'all want to know the secret to weed-free yard? Wow, nobody know? Y'all don't want to know? Oh, no yard? All right, who's got another guess? Anybody got another guess? All right, the secret to weed-free yard is weed every day. Pull a weed every day. Every time you walk in the door, if you see a weed, yank it up. That's the best way to teach your kids, grandkids to pull up a weed. That's the best way to have weed-free yard. Also, yes, mulch, pre-emergence, fertilizer, pre-emergence, and stuff like that does work too. So, also, by the way, since we're on the subject of weeds, please don't put nutsedge in your compost pile. You will have it everywhere. So, I wouldn't do that. All right, so we talked about the recipe, or the ratios of nitrogen to carbon. So, greens have more carbon in them, or more nitrogen in them, excuse me. So, things like fresh grass clippings, vegetable fruit scraps, manure, that works well. Some people will kickstart this by adding ammonium nitrate fertilizer. I personally don't. I rather keep things a little all natural, although if you want to debate whether mineral fertilizers, traditional fertilizers, or organic, I'm happy to have that debate with you later. But anyway, so browns are more carbon, like cornstalk, straw, things that if it looks brown, it's more carbon, okay? So the idea is to keep this 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. That's the magic recipe. You say, well, preacher, how do I know how much that is? Well, it's about 30, for every 30 parts, or every shovelful of browns, I add one shovelful of nitrogen, of grass clippings, whatever. It can be kind of difficult to maintain that. So what a lot of people will do is they'll have some tall grass beside the compost pile, or they'll put the browns in there and they won't add it until like they cut the grass and collect a few clippings. That's usually what you do. I told a lady one time a good way to estimate this: if you've ever cut your mowed leaves and bagged them, and you get a little bit of grass in there, and it looks about like you got the ratio, you're probably good to go. And that's a good way to figure out how much you got in there. And what I like to do is kind of mix it up before I add it to the main pile. That way I know it's good and mixed up, and then I give the pile one good solid turn. That way I know it's going to break down pretty good. All right, so pile size. Do I want a bigger pile or a smaller pile? Who wants to take a vote on this one? How many people say small? Less than 3 foot? 3 foot or less? All right. How many people say 5 feet or greater? The bigger the better. One person? Who don't care? Just kidding. So if we have a small pile, we're going to get too much heat loss. It's not big enough to maintain that heat. So if we get too big of a pile, and usually I say, the last time I did this talk and I said that, this lady said, well, I have a 10-foot tall pile of compost, and I've seen the city compost stuff. How's it not do that? Well, it's all about turning and getting the aeration in there. Usually with slower composting methods where they just let it sit there and rot, you don't get a lot of air penetration. Now, if you keep it between 3 foot and 5 foot, so 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, 3 feet wide, or 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet, that's usually the Goldilocks zone. That's usually good enough to where it's going to compost pretty good, it's going to cook, and it's also what? I can manage this, right? If I have a pile as big as this room, now I got to go find a bulldozer, or excuse me, a backhoe and turn this thing, and I don't want to spend money on this too much because I'm trying to save money by doing all this, right? So have a pile that you can manage. Now, aeration and moisture. I like to aerate mine at least, if you're trying to do a fast compost, a fast cook, you want to turn it every week at least. Some people turn it twice a week. I personally think that's a little too much. That's, a little, kind of the old adage of stirring the brownies too much to make them tough. Plus, once a week is easier to remember. So just once a week I go out there and turn it. Now also when I turn it, I usually spray it. I just spray to lightly moisten it. You don't want it sopping wet. You don't want it too dry. I give the example of you want to be able to squeeze it or touch it, and it should be damp to the touch, like a wrung out sponge. It should be about that damp. So, and a good way to see if you're getting a good cook is if you can turn it and you see steam coming out. That's the best way to figure out if you're doing it correctly. Like that. So 140 degrees is the magic number. Now, how do we know how we get to that? You can actually get a thermometer, a compost thermometer. Believe it or not, you can actually measure this. When I did my internship at St. Louis, Missouri Botanical Gardens in St. Louis, they actually had these giant thermometers. They would stick in this thing. They looked like spears. And of course, their pile was as big as this room. And they turned it every 3 days. Yeah, every 3 days, because they had a different system set up. And plus, they were using that compost like daily. And you could just see the steam just billowing off of it. And it was so hot at one point, you couldn't even touch it. Now, I will caution you about one thing. We recently had a lady in Spartanburg that almost set her house on fire. She had heard that you could use sawdust. So, but the problem was she just used just sawdust. Anybody ever been near a sawmill and seen the smoke coming out of the piles? Where there's smoke, there's fire. What that actually is just the heat down in there. It just builds up and builds up and builds up and actually catch that on fire. Usually if you have other materials in there and you're moistening it, you don't have to worry about that. So, but just be aware of that if you use too much. The 140 degrees is just enough to kill the bad bacteria and bad fungi, but it will allow the beneficial ones to survive. They can survive a higher temperature. Now, can the pile get too hot? Yes, it can. What a lot of professional companies that bag it do is they will actually sterilize it at this point. So once it's reached 140 degrees, they call it done, stop the cooking process, and they actually steam it. Now, not all of them do that. There are a few of them that do it. They're getting away from it because steaming is expensive, believe it or not, because the way they have to do it is just incredibly expensive. When I worked in a nursery, we looked at sterilizing our potting mix, and it was going to cost us so much money, it was going to bankrupt us. So it's not cost prohibitive, it's not cost effective for them to do it. So not a lot of companies are doing it anymore. So how you can tell, when you open the bag, it should have a good earthy, or when you're testing a pile, it should have a very good earthy smell. It should almost smell like a good, like if you have good earthy mushrooms, it should almost smell kind of like that. It should have a good earthy kind of smell to it. It also will be very dark. That's usually a good sign that everything is broken down. If you see a few things that still haven't broken down, you can probably turn it and let it cook for like another week or so, in 2 weeks, and probably be okay. So that's the best way to determine it. So this is where I have a little fun with y'all. I like to add a little bit of my old compost back to the pile. Why would I want to do that?
It's got microbes.
Bingo! That's exactly why Jack Daniels keeps their recipe so consistent. And I have to put this in here because I'm from Tennessee, so okay. So I call this sour mash compost. So they call it sour mash whiskey because they take the old mash, part of the old mash, and put it in with the new mash to keep that same flavor. I'm saying it's sour mash compost because you're taking a little bit of the old compost, putting it back in the pile, you're replenishing those beneficial bacteria and fauna to help keep the compost pile cooking. So, like I said, there's fast composting and slow composting. Fast composting usually takes about anywhere from 2 to 3 months maximum. If you turn it faster, you might get it done in a month, but usually it's going to take about 2 months to get that done. It's usually ready to use when it's dark and crumbly. And like I said, you want to turn that pile at least once a week. You can go as quick as every 3 days. I'm easier to remember a week. It's just easier for me. It's better to do it in layers because it's easier to turn. Now, slow composting is more of the lazy guys and girls way to do it. Okay, so I use the example: if you got leaves that you want to recycle every year, this is the method for you. Okay, so you want to pile it up and you leave it. And usually when it starts having that nice rotting smell is when you turn it. But so that can be anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. So now it takes at least 6 months to yield compost, or even a year to yield it. So and usually compost is ready. The part that is ready is usually at the bottom of the pile. If you're going to compost, I'd go with the quick composting method, because if you've never smelled rotting compost, like truly rotting compost, you really don't want it. Trust me. All right, so now we'll move on talking about some of the different structures you can use. So circular bins, I like these. So now, before I get into this, there is no perfect system, okay? You do what's best for you. You do you, boo, okay? So that's the best way to do it. So you find what works for you. I will go through the pros and cons of each one of these, okay? What I like about this one is you get a lot of good airflow. You can, unless you just tack it in here, you can probably get everything pretty accessible where you can do this, where you can actually get in there and turn it. The only thing I don't like about it is it's not really, unless you kind of make this where you can open it or don't make it so tall that you can't turn it, it can be a little hard to turn. That's the only thing I don't like about this. So if you got slow composting, it's probably the better bet for you. This is actually the system I prefer, especially for if you want to do fast composting. The 3-chamber system, and this can be as big or as small as you want it. Again, we talked about no less than 3 feet, no more than 5 feet. You can make this with nicer wood, or you can make it with old pallets. You can make it with chicken wires. You can see in the top picture. You can just kind of see how this is constructed. Usually this is screens in between here to allow airflow. This, usually the posts right here are notched so that you can just slide boards in between here as the pile grows. That way it's just a little bit easier to maintain, and plus it allows you to do what? Turn it. So usually what they do is they'll start with one end down here, they'll pile everything up, let it compost. When it's time to turn, you bring it in the next bin or bring it in the far bin, and you turn it over, let it cook, do the same thing, and then when it's ready, to store it, you put it in the middle bin or in one of the bins you want to store it in. Have I lost anybody? Everybody good?
So you take it from the beginning one and put it into one of the other ones?
Correct. Either way you want to do it.
Turn it in.
And these can be longer. I've seen people that have 4 or 5 of these lined up, but I wouldn't do more than 3.
But you don't turn it in the bin that...
You can, but I wouldn't. I'd turn it into the next one.
Okay.
Well, the last time I had one of these, I just did it like this. I just literally took the shovel and turned it over, and then turned it over again. That way my final bin was usually my ending compost. Okay. That's the way I did it. So.
Are you putting your table scraps in one bin for a week, 2 weeks, and then taking that entire thing and putting it in the next bin for your...
Not necessarily a week. You can still turn it inside that. You can do a small turn. It just kind of depends on how it's doing in there. So these are very popular. Who has one of these? All right, cool. So these are actually pretty good. They do get a little hotter than 140 degrees if you let them, but that's okay. That's still good. This works for a small area, or if you just don't have a whole lot. I mean, this is more for if you got a big yard, if you got a big area and you're doing a lot and you're really trying to, just have a place to put all that stuff. This is more for, I've just got an average size yard, I don't really want to have a pile. I don't want to create anything new. I just want something I can just easily turn. This is the way for you. Again, you just give this a spin when you add everything and just let it sit and you just turn it once a week. So, and some of these actually can get pretty elaborate, and you can have the little bin that holds the finished compost down below. So, the only thing I don't like about these, like I said, they can get a little hotter than 140 degrees, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'd rather you do that than nothing at all.
Do you know what degree that microbes die?
180.
180.
180 to 200 degrees.
That's huge things.
That's why usually I'll tell you to cook your meat to at least 165 to 180. That's why they want everything done like that. Yes, ma'am.
We have the one in the corner of bottom left.
Okay.
And it's always extremely wet. So we can't manage to get the right ratio. What would you recommend?
Drill a couple holes in it. I know you're destroying it. That's something you just pay money for. But honestly, I would drill a couple holes in it to let that drain out. Okay. And you could probably drill 3, and you don't have to be big holes. They can be like 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, something like that. I'm not very good with carpentry, so if I misquote something carpentry or something like that, y'all just forgive me. So I just follow the carpenter, okay? So I would do like 1, 2, 3, or 4 holes on each side, or you can even do it in multiple. That way it just provides a little more drainage. So that's probably what's going on. That's usually what I see going on, because in fact, it's funny you say that, because I got called out to a lady's house, had the same thing, and she had soup. And when she opened that lid, I mean, I usually don't get sick, but I got sick. I mean, I was just like, because she had used like old seafood shells. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I was just like, So anyway, all right.
I got,
Yes, sir.
On that 3, go back one.
Sure.
On those systems, is there an advantage of having like putting down cement like pad versus the ground?
So if you want to keep it, this is actually personal preference. If you want to keep it clean, in case y'all didn't hear, he's asking why, is it more beneficial to have a concrete pad or to have, something on the ground to kind of keep it off the ground? If you want to keep it clean and, quote unquote dirt free, that's fine. Some people do like that because it's easier to find the bottom of the pile when they're doing their turning. So that's actually preference. I'm cheap, I don't do that. So I just usually lay it on the ground. I like that also, being on the ground, because my argument for not doing the concrete is that allows any earthworms that are there to come up. So that's why I really like that. So, and plus, concrete's how much is it going for a yard now? So unless you do it, well, you can do it with Quikrete, but so I just prefer all natural. So pocketbook wise and just process. So speaking of odors, like I talked with the seafood, if we have a rotten odor coming out of the pile, it may be not enough air. If it's too wet, the remedy for that is turn the pile. And if you guys would like a larger version of this, I have my business cards up here. You can email me. The extension is wrong. That's all their old business cards. So just call the main number and ask for me, and you'll find me. If it has an ammonia odor, there's probably too many greens, too much nitrogen going on in there. Now, I'm going to step outside the composting box for a second. This ammonia odor, this is usually, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to tap your screen. This is usually when the pile has gone anaerobic, meaning there's not enough air in there. So anaerobic means without oxygen. Aerobic means with oxygen. So when something goes anaerobic, it usually has more of a vinegar smell to it, has the ammonia smell, and it usually means it's not been composted properly. When stepping outside the composting box for a second, if you get a load of mulch, or if you go to buy a bag and you can smell that, don't buy it. Or reject it, whatever. That's why I always tell people, before you go buy a truckload of mulch or something like that, go get your hands dirty and turn the pile a little bit with your hands and smell the inside of it. If it has that vinegary smell to it, just walk away. It should have a nice, now if it's pine bark, you're going to smell the pine, okay? That's, some people confuse that with the vinegar smell. It's a very, very strong vinegar sour smell. So you'll know it when you smell it, but it should have a good smell to it. Now, low pile temperature, this is usually not enough air or moisture. You're getting too few greens. It is very difficult to cook compost in the wintertime to get that pile temperature up, okay? So if your pile temperature drops during the wintertime, don't necessarily freak out. That's just because it's cold outside. Some people compensate for this by putting black plastic over it to help heat it up. I mean, my argument against that is, are you using compost in the wintertime? No. So why worry about it? Just wait, let it sit there. It'll be fine. You know you can get the pile back up to 180, 140 degrees in February or March, right before you're going to use it anyway. So just relax, go have Christmas, and just worry about it when it comes. So if you have a high pile temperature, The pile's probably too large. It's not getting enough air. So remember how we talked about that perfect mix of air, perfect mix of water? It's all about balancing that. Remember, we're controlled decomposition. So you can reduce the pile size, you can turn it. Now, if you have pests in it, like rats, raccoons, insects, that's usually somebody's put meat or something like that in there, something they shouldn't be putting in there. All right, so worm composting. Who has tried this? Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, you had a question. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to talk about the grass clippings.
Mm-hmm.
I had the 3 bins in the Wilmington area,
Mm-hmm.
and I found that if I mowed my lawn and layered real fresh grass clippings,
Mm-hmm.
the pile didn't do as good as if I dried the grass clippings on the lawn for about an hour, no, for about a day. Because if they got too wet, they matted down.
Yeah.
And I would layer the green grass that was dried with straw, and I would just layer.
I can see that.
I noticed that if you use really fresh grass clippings, you just have to be careful about how thick you put them in there, because they mat and they just got the smell was too bad. It was too much moisture.
Okay. That's probably what that is, yeah, because especially if you cut it early in the morning or something like that, it's usually got a lot of moisture in it anyway. Because when you cut grass, when you cut plants, you'll notice it's wet on the tip. That plants are really bleeding is what they're doing. So that's probably what you're seeing. Actually, that's what I do. I usually pile my grass somewhere up or like lay it out and let it dry for a little bit. But usually I recycle my grass clippings anyway.
Yeah.
So very rarely do I collect clippings, and when I do, I usually just use it as mulch in my vegetable garden. So that's what I do. All right, so worm composting. So if you want to buy one of these, they're about $100 on Amazon. And no, Amazon didn't pay me to say that. You can find them also on other online sources. They'll run you between $100 and $120. You can also build one out of buckets or, like Rubbermaid tent, Rubbermaid bins or something like that. You can make your own. All you need to do is drill holes in it so the worms can come up in there. You want to use red wrigglers. The reason is because those are the best ones for breaking down vegetable fruit scraps and things like that. Some people use night crawlers trying to double up and make a fish bait business out of this on the side. You won't get as good compost. Okay, pick one or the other. If you're going to raise worms, do raise worms. If you're going to make compost, make compost. Now, if you get too many worms in there, yeah, go fishing or feed it to your chicken or whatever. How this works is all your vegetable scraps. Now, I have never done this indoors. They claim there's no smell. I can't smell it when I'm outdoors. But Mrs. Jeffers would be very hard convinced to let me put this inside the house, okay? So, because she hears the word worms and, stuff like that. So basically what you do is you have these air holes for obvious reasons. You put this bedding material, which is basically newspaper, essentially is what this is. And then you have like vegetable scraps. You can put grass clippings here, but usually it's like kitchen scraps is what this is. The worms actually live in here, right in here actually, excuse me. They move up and down through these holes right here, feeding and pooping, essentially is what they're doing. Now the worm castings, or their excrement, for a better word, is what you actually use as the compost. Now this requires some frequent checking. The worms do take quite a little bit of time, about 2 to 3 weeks on average, maybe even as high as 4 to 6 weeks, to actually break it down. But it does produce some pretty good compost. So that's why you always want to try and preserve your worms as best you can in your yard and your garden. Because if you find one that's like, dying and trying to find water on the concrete, pick it up, rescue it, go take it to your vegetable garden. Because they're valuable. Because as they digest that soil, that they're adding those enzymes and adding more nutrients to that soil. Now, the juice, shall we say, from all this is it can be made as compost tea. You can use that as a substitute of Miracle-Gro. I would dilute it using about, for every cup you use, a cup you collect, I would dilute that in about 5 gallons of water. You can go as low as 1 gallon of water. I would probably more be inclined to do it in a gallon and a half to 2 gallons, just because you really, there's no really a way to know to test this unless you have our lab test it, which is going to take a week. So I just tell people, look, for every cup, dilute it in a gallon and a half of water, 2 gallons of water, call it a day. Most of the time they're putting on vegetable plants. Shrubs, they can tolerate more high salts than bedding plants or annuals. If you burn something with fertilizer, usually it's going to be annuals, and perennials is one that you find it on, or vegetables. So don't freak out too much. All right, so this is yes ma'am.
Is there a temperature that worms do better?
Not that I know of. Usually worms is more of a passive thing. You don't have to turn the pile. You don't have to monitor the temperatures closely.
But I mean, you wouldn't want to keep them in a garage.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, above, I'd say above 40 degrees is probably what you're looking for. Yeah, 40 or higher is what you're probably looking for. So, yes ma'am.
Can you add worm to a compost bin?
You most certainly can. What will happen though is they'll probably stay on the outside edges or at the bottom because they won't go in the core. Usually when you have a pile, right here in the center is where a lot of your heat, it's basically like a core heat. And I'll tell you how you can see this. If you're bored one day and you don't have anything to do, go to a mulch yard and kind of feel the outside, start digging, and the closer you get to the center, you're going to start feeling hotter and hotter and hotter. They're going to kind of be at the bottom or on the outside edges. You could do that. If I was going to do that, I would add them to the to like the barely almost finished compost. That way it's almost at the end of the cooking process. It's probably not getting as hot, and or if you're just storing it, that's when I would add them if I were you. Yes, ma'am.
What's the likelihood of bears being attracted to a compost pile?
Ooh, that's a very good question.
They could turn it for you naturally.
I was going to say, I would say if there is fresh fruits and vegetables in there, there is a very good chance that would, if they're around, they could probably smell it. Yeah, that's a toughie because, yeah, if you're afraid of bears, I would stick away from vegetable scraps. Usually, though, I would think they're more attracted to like greasy smells, like fried chicken. I have a funny bear story.
I know our neighbors, they've had them get their bird seed.
Oh, okay.
You know, they'll bend
Yeah.
but
I doubt it attracts them, but if they're in it.
If they're in it, they probably would find it.
So they might check it out.
What you might consider doing, you might try to do like the closed bin or something like that, and that way they can't turn it over.
And then in your list, you had paper that you can put in. Is there any special kind of paper that you can't use? Should you shred it?
You shred it. Shred it will make it break down faster. You can use newspaper. You can use old paper. Usually, though, if it has, if it's something like photo paper, I wouldn't put that in there. But any kind of natural paper would be fine. Yes, ma'am.
What about using the horse bedding from stalls, being that the horses urinate in there?
Yeah.
Do you use the bedding?
You sure? Yeah, just turn it and let it cook and compost.
Pellet bedding?
What I would do is, what I used to do when my first job was actually a horse stall engineer, shall we say, and I actually I was in charge of piling that product, shall we say, and getting it ready for a farmer that used it down the road. And what we would do when we took the bedding, we would actually rinse it, and I would let it and wash it all the way through. Even if I got it too wet, I would just spread it out, even pile, let it evaporate, and then pile it back up. That usually helps leach some of that salts and some of that high nitrogen out of it, and then allows it to cook better. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else got any questions? All right, any other questions besides composting, gardening questions? All right, well, quick plug. My Master Gardener course is coming up in August. If you guys are interested, it's actually during the day now. It's from 9:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, starting from August 6th to December 3rd. and that's a fun class. We have a lot of fun in that class. We cover everything from vegetable gardening to composting to soils to fertilizers, you name it, we talk about it. Very fun course. And I'd love to have some people from Woodruff up there. Oh, sure.
Landrum.
Sorry?
Landrum.
Oh, I say Woodruff, I'm sorry. Sorry, didn't mean to insult y'all. From Landrum, excuse me. We also want Woodruff people too. We take everybody from everybody everywhere, but from Landrum especially. Now, we also have free rain barrel classes for those of you who are Spartanburg County residents, which I'm sure you are. Free rain barrel classes. So there's one coming up in July. If you follow us on Facebook, Spartanburg County Extension, you can look for those classes. I post all my classes on Facebook and also Spartanburg County Extension, clemson.edu/extension/Spartanburg County. That's usually a good way to find us, or you can just Google Spartanburg County Extension, then you'll find us. Or you can just come down there and see us. We have all the flyers up.
Can you
Sure.
give me a quick rundown of a rain barrel class?
Of the rain barrel class? So the rain barrel class is a lot of fun. What we do is we'll bring you in. It's free, and we talk briefly about stormwater while we're doing the rain barrel class and how it benefits the environment and benefits the county. And then you actually get to build your rain barrel in the house. It's actually used Coca-Cola syrup drums, 55 gallons, and they're clean. And you get a free kit that connects to your gutters. It's totally sealed for mosquitoes, so you don't have to worry about mosquitoes. The average time to put it together is about 5 minutes. And I tell people, if you don't want to put it together in the class, you can take it home. There's instructions, you can put it together at your house. So, and that's it in a nutshell. So, yes, ma'am.
We're in the process of trying to get rid of the kudzu around our property. Is that something that would be okay to put in with the composting?
I wouldn't. The reason is because that weed is pretty aggressive. I'd burn it, literally, and then use the ash. Use the ash in the compost pile.
Is that okay to use ash?
Yeah, it just raises the alkalinity a little bit. It won't hurt anything. Ash actually provides a lot of potassium. So, and fun fact, I didn't know this until I usually do these like fun little video searches at lunch. I didn't know that they used to use ash back in the colonial period as soap. So, I never knew that.
That's how they made it with lye.
With lye and ash. I didn't know that until today. Yes, ma'am.
The master gardener classes that you were talking about, where do you hold them?
Where do I hold those? I usually hold them at the Spartanburg County Extension Office. That's at 612 Chesney Highway in Spartanburg. You just go straight down 26, get on Business 85, get on 585, get off the Whitney Road exit, turn left, past the second light on the right. All right, well, thank you guys very much. I've enjoyed it. Hope you guys have.